din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. до окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, отдых и на труд. Весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.
Утреннего в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. How are we all doing out there? It is the evening of the 28th of December, 2025. We do a handbrake turn into the hairpin bend of the last part of the course of the treacherous roadway that has been the year 2025. And as we come towards the end of things, hopefully not the end of all things, we are looking at both back over the course of the year in these shows we're doing, and of course forward to the future. But the events, dear boy, as Harold Macmillan might have said, never stop. They they retain the capacity to surprise us, and also we have the privileged position of being able to analyze a lot of these things in real time in a way that wasn't available in the past. So tonight we're going to be covering the latest Russian defense plan as or defense priorities as outlined by Defense Minister Belousov in a recent speech given before the Russian Ministry of Defense board. There is the Starmer regime in Britain moving towards conscription. We'll be looking at that. And the US has bombed Nigeria, a place, region called Sokoto, claiming they're targeting ISIS, but we all know what that actually means. We'll be getting into that a little later on. Until then, thanks to everybody who's tuned in so far. And be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. Now, I'm just going to do a quick greeting to those who are in the chat so far. So we have Working Prole Incorporated, we have Your Dialectical, we have In It For Fun, we have Dealing with Franklin, Chris Rogers, Lone Bart, Peep Show 090, Line Slinker, who who's joining us apparently from Russia. Anti-Mat TV. We have Jerry. We have Thomas Wolf from Oklahoma. We have YLDB Backup, who says, I feel like Alex McKay Klippenstein. I think you mean Clarenberg. I'm not working with Ken Klippenstein, as far as I'm aware. Decline and Fall is like the British version of the Grey Zone, both great publications. Well, we're getting there. We're working towards the Decline and Fall platform becoming a much bigger platform. It's certainly come on a long way over the course of the last year, and hopefully will continue to grow in the new year. Decline and Fall, by the way, will be back on the air tomorrow, so be sure to join us for that. Right, who else we got here? We have Bob Parr from an increasingly authoritarian Australia. Well, where Britain and the United States lead, the wretched Australian ruling class follow. Australia, I think you'll know this already if you live there, has very little independent existence, and well, that will remain the case. Yes, hello to YepX. I did get your email. It's on a list, my to-do list of correspondence to reply to. Sid, hello to you. Alex Oliveira joins us from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Good to have you with us. It's an international audience again tonight. Hello to Nikki and Speedy Bozo, who joins us from the northern part of perfidious Albion. Right. We also got David Ball over there in New Jersey. We also have a long-time listener who is on Rumble. So tonight we are live on Rumble, Twitch, YouTube, X, and Substack. So you can take your pick as to the variety of corporate platforms and slightly less corporate platforms that you can follow us along with. YepX says, I'm disappointed that there's those who call themselves communists and Marxists who don't like Alex. I find it to be a wealth of information and both reasonable and logical in his views and analyses. Well, that might be one of the reasons why some people out there don't like me, but don't be disappointed. Look, taking the analysis or carrying out the analysis and the kind of analysis that we do here, and to an extent are done on Decline and Fall as well, but especially that are done here, this doesn't make you particularly popular amongst the hallowed corridors of academia or in the Western left. It's why I do this and why I have no intention of going back into academia again. Western academia is a horror show, a nightmare of ghoulish obscenity. You couldn't do any interesting work there at any level. That's the way that Western academia deals with politics, sociology, history is quite frankly a fraud and a joke. It teaches pure propaganda. So if it's academics who don't like me, well, I'm not surprised, because you have to be a deeply compromised and rancid individual to make it into the higher levels of Western academia. So the academic left doesn't like me. Who the fuck cares? And as for those in the rest of the left who don't care for Marxism, Leninism, and don't care for me, well, quite frankly, I couldn't give a shit. And I would encourage you, like, not to be discouraged. Like, this isn't. I'm not. Good job. I'm not in this for popularity, because if you reject the holy nostrums of the Western left, if you reject their shallow and empty concept, like their supposed anti-authoritarianism, which is we were talking about Noam Chomsky on the last Decline and Fall show. I mean, that's one of the absolute wretched creations that he's played a part in, supposed anti-authoritarianism, which is just anti-communism, identity politics, gender ideology, things like that. If you reject these things, if you reject basically idealism, because more than anything else, the Western left is lost in idealism. More than if I've been rereading, due to the fact that my fiance, who is a wonderful woman who knows me very well, bought me like a massive collection of Lenin books for Christmas. So I've been reading again Materialism and Imperial Criticism. And you read that and you find out just how long this battle within Marxism and more widely amongst those in the left, how long the battle between like materialism, dialectical materialism, and various forms of idealism has been going on. The Western left is purely idealist creation. It wears the clothing sometimes of dialectical materialism, but everything that it holds sacred is rooted in idealism. And if that lot don't care for me, so much the better. I wouldn't want to be in their shitty little club, to be honest. Don't have no desire to be. Okay, we've also got Andy from Oz. Hello to you. We have Caustic Grip. We have Rob the Slav joining us from Detroit. YLD Backup likes the jacket and tie. Well, it's here to stay. I prefer the formal clothing, should we say, for on-air presentation. Speedy Bozo says, thanks to this channel, I was able to tell family members at Christmas some new info about Ukraine. They were enraged at first, but then learning did happen eventually. Well, I'm glad you were able to have that discussion. And if I played any part in helping that happen, then I am glad to have done so. Hello to G4RG4NTU4. YouTube really needs to do this, reverse this thing where they've changed everybody's name. Hello to you out there in sunny Ireland. Hello to Perfidious Joe. Hello to David King, who says, big day, Trump barks at proxy as the caravan moves on. Yes. Good evening to Iman Puedama. Sid Hatfield says, apparently conservative radio stations in this area are, you're in what, like the Midwest, is it? Promoting the idea that the Russians are experiencing mass desertions in the Donbass region. Can we say projection? Well, that is projection in actual fact. I'm sure there are some desertions from the Russian army. Every army has its deserters, but that's, we'll get to the report by Belousov in a minute. It's a fact that there's increasing desertions from the Ukrainian armed forces, and the Ukrainians are struggling to replace all the men that they're losing, not just from desertions, but mainly through death in combat, horrific wounding, which renders them incapable of returning to combat, and of course, being taken prisoner and desertion. So, hello to George Stoko. Hello to Jim Spencer, New Orleans, USA. We also have Almir in the once and future Republic of Slovenia, Socialist Yugoslavia. What else do we have here? Sid says, honestly, I'm becoming more and more suspicious of any black leaders here in the US who constantly remind the black proletariat that their biggest obstacle is white supremacy. Who does that help? Well, I mean, there's various different forms of ideological supremacy which are pushed by the ruling class. White supremacy is one of them, but the thing is that for the black bourgeoisie in the United States and the black bourgeois leadership, to me, they're in a very dubious but mutually beneficial relationship with those who preach white supremacy. Because you preach white supremacy, what are you doing? On the one hand, you're rallying behind you the most reactionary sections of the US petty bourgeois, proletariat, and lumpens. But on the other hand, then you're assisting like the black bourgeois politicians who, as Sid indicates in his comment, will talk all day about white supremacy, but then basically urge the black working class to rally behind some scumbag bourgeois who just happens to be, broadly speaking, the same skin color as they are, which of course means precious little, as many black bourgeois politicians in the United States and elsewhere have proved. Now, civilizational supremacy, white supremacy, various forms of male supremacy, female supremacy in some cases, though that's less of a propaganda point. These are all propaganda points that the ruling class will push at various different times, and at various different times they will lean more into one than the other. So J.D. Vance goes before like Turning Points USA and makes a nativist speech to rile up the crowd there and make his play for their votes for his run in 2028. This is, of course, what he was doing there. It's a cynical piece of manipulation, as will be his upcoming divorce from his current wife and him marrying Erica Kirk, allegedly. But once he's lent into that, he'll then lean back in the other direction and start talking about how great America is because it's got so many different faiths in it. You know, Trump does the same thing. A lot of cynical politicians do this. Like they will try and like pin down a ultra reactionary base, then they'll pivot back again and start making more liberal noises. You know, this is the standard operating procedure of any politician in the bourgeois system in the United States. All these things are things for them to points of division that they can amplify within the working class and also try and gain themselves some votes out of it. Now, there's as has been revealed by the war on Russia, there's been various different things that have emerged since the special military operation began, which remind us that things like civilizational supremacy are deep rooted in the West, not just in the United States, but in, of course, old perfidious Albion, Western Europe, especially. The concept of the West as the only civilized place in the world. This is very, very big. It's a huge thing in the West, and as was revealed by Joseph Borrell in his European Garden comment. But so the attitude of communists to all of this must be, of course, to completely oppose it. But far too many communists over the past 100 years have revealed themselves to also be Western chauvinists. So interesting points there to consider further, perhaps in a future Q&A. Finish, like I said, if there was a system collapse now, the odds are that the fascists are best organized to take advantage, sorry to say. Well, just to answer this point straight away, you're right in a sense in that fascism as a organic phenomenon grows out of the ruling class. It's a bourgeois ideology. And so the ruling class are, of course, system collapse, I think I have a problem with that term, because what it implies is some sort of natural process which is like irreversible. What we're talking about in the West really is like the collapse is, of course, built into capitalism itself. If there's a fascist takeover, it'll be a fascist takeover that comes about because a section of the ruling class decides that the dominant section of the ruling class decides that they want to that the only way that they can maintain the system is by removing the remaining bourgeois democratic facades to it, and institutes like a more comprehensive dictatorship. So fascism comes from the ruling class. It's always a bourgeois phenomenon. It's not by nature a proletarian phenomenon. It's an imposition of the bourgeoisie as a form of emergency rule by them. We may need to go back to the definitions of fascism later on, but to answer the in it for funds question, no, it's not a it's a naturally occurring phenomenon in the ruling class itself. It's the most blunt and brutal expression of bourgeois politics. The reason why it has developed the way that it has into something which has a mass base was because the bourgeoisie needed to respond to communism by having like a reactionary movement that could gain a mass base to act as a counterweight to communist parties. Now, there was a comment earlier on in the chat which said the left willingly disarmed itself, and that's largely correct, but it wasn't just that it was physically disarmed, even though that was true to an extent, but it also ideologically disarmed. The left gets ideologically disarmed because the left in the West still fundamentally believes that there will be that bourgeois democracy is essentially still the path to liberation. Many of them still believe that. Now, there's a difference to be defined here between the necessary defense of the remaining bourgeois democratic liberties that do exist and or should we say making the mistake of thinking that that is adequate politics. It's not. Like, you need to at this stage defend what liberties we do have access to, but at the same time to think that like you're going to be able to vote in socialism via the constitutional processes of the United States or Britain or France or Germany or Italy or any of the imperialist countries, that's a fool's errand. You're never going to be able to find liberation that way. But the problem with a lot, again, this comes back to a problem with a lot of the left, is because their approach is not materialist, it is idealist, and they don't carry out a proper analysis anymore of the nature of the state, and that many of their leaders are very petty bourgeois and are immersed in like official, basically Labour Party aligned left politics, which leads them back towards parliamentarism constantly. So this is one of the weaknesses of the left, and it's one of the reasons why they always they never make any headway. Because the reality is that they chose to believe after World War II that the bourgeois democratic method will lead you to socialism, and they still do believe that. They will deny it. Many of them will deny it, but they still do believe that one day there will be a quote unquote workers' government elected somehow. Maybe the frozen brain of Bernie Sanders will win the presidential election in 2052 or something, and institute New Deal Mark II, or Jeremy Corbyn at the age of 90 will get to finally head a government which is a coalition between your party, the Greens, and I don't know, George Galloway's hat. and that will somehow institute socialism. Again, complete fantasy. Most of the left in the West is lost in fantasies, and that's what we mean by ideologically disarmed. All right, let's just scroll here to the end of the comments. Why would Gabriel Rockhill endorse Kamala Harris and the No Kings protest? Well, you'd need to ask him for his reasons. I don't know. We didn't get into it. I would only be speculating if I got into that now. But seeing as we are here, I'll speculate on some reasons, which is that when there is a severe lack of working class action, some people pick up on any mass movement is seen by some communists as having the potential to recruit from. So like that No Kings protest, which is a complete like billionaire astroturf job, like an element of the US ruling class got behind that, and that's the reason why it became as big as it did. Now again, here we get the question, the tactical question of the of how to approach like something which is a bourgeois protest, or a protest organized ultimately by a section of the US bourgeoisie. Now, first the question to ask is, well, is it something which is going to attract any workers? So if you're in the United States and some No Kings protest is being held, you need to interrogate the question as to, well, are there going to be any working class people there? And if there are, is it likely to be people who are worth talking to? See, if there's people worth talking to at a bourgeois organized protest, if there's workers who are going to be there, it might be worth putting the communist case to, then it's worth going just to leaflet it and to make some kind of intervention. However, if it's just the usual suspects who are not just non-working class but actively rabidly anti-communist, then it's not. So you need to make a tactical decision of whether you approach these protests. If there's a significant amount of workers being mobilized by a section of the bourgeoisie, then communists should be there to at least speak to them. Now, I don't know what Rockhill's position is on that. I haven't seen it. But the mistake would be to go from making a tactical decision to go along and make some kind of intervention to try and speak to any workers who are there. And the mistake would be to then go too far with that and to think that you could then somehow influence those protests, or you might get to lead them in some way, which is not what you should be trying to do. Right. Okay. Question: outside of NATO, what country leaving would do the most damage if it left the alliance? Germany. If Germany left NATO, I won't say it would be the absolute end, but it would do almost as much damage as the United States leaving it, just as Germany leaving the EU would be the end. If Germany left NATO, that would basically rip the NATO system to pieces, which is why German politics is so strictly controlled. Well, only as much, I suppose, only as much as British or French politics is, but why like anti-NATO forces are so relentlessly marginalized there, or they're like the anti-NATO forces represented by like joke parties like Die Linke, who would never do anything to actually threaten Germany's NATO membership. But yeah, but if NATO is to be damaged by anything other than the US leaving, Germany leaving would be the big one. That would be it. Okay, so getting then to the recent comments made by Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov in a meeting of the Russian Ministry of Defense board that was held recently. This was, of course, a combined session that he did along with Putin, and they were looking at the recent achievements of the Russian armed forces, especially military operation. But then the bulk of Belousov's speech was looking at the development of the Russian armed forces over the last year and what the plan was going to be for the next year. So just to deal with Belousov's comments on the Ukraine war first, Belousov commented that the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces had been reduced by 1/3 in the last year, and the Ukrainians were having great difficulty in replacing the casualties that have been inflicted on them over the last 12 months, whereas previously they had been able to replace the damage that was done in the initial phase of the special military operation. So between February and August of the first period, where the Russians made some advances in 2022, that did a lot of damage to the initial Ukrainian army. So then a new one was built to do the offensive up near, well, first of all, down in the Kherson region, and then up in Kharkov in later 2022, September 2022. And that actually paid off in the sense that they exploited an overstretched Russian line. That army was severely damaged and then ground down, and they had to build up another one for usage in the Zaporozhye counteroffensive in 2023, summer 2023, which was a total utter disaster, which left almost which destroyed that army. They then had to rebuild another army, which was partially used for the incursion into the Kursk region in 2024, which again ran for a hell of a long time, the incursion into the Kursk region, and cost them tens of thousands of men. And this army was then later ground down and destroyed. So that's at least 3 armies that have been built, equipped, trained, and then destroyed. And this is Belousov's point, and it seems to be one that is backed up even by leaks coming out of the Ukrainian government, which is that they're struggling to fill the gaps in the line now. This is why you're seeing more rapid and more wild, shall we say, fighting and rapid Russian advances, because unlike in 2023 or 2024, the Ukrainians have fewer and fewer men available. The number of mercenaries, shall we say, sheep-dipped foreign troops that are available seems to have been lowered as well. There were an awful lot of casualties brought on thanks to the elimination of a lot of the foreign mercenaries by the Russians. And this is also why there is a sort of swirling panic in Kiev and in the European capitals, because they are realizing that Ukraine is running out of men, which is why there's now this bartering amongst between the Europeans and the British and the Americans over what they're going to do. And this will lead us to the British conscription plan in just a moment. But Belousov claims that the Ukrainian army is on the point of collapse and that the AFU will collapse. And from everything we can see, both from the West and from the Russian side, that seems to be the correct assessment. Now, Belousov also highlighted the key threat to Russian security that the Russian Ministry of Defense is obliged to respond to. And that is, of course, NATO. Now, Belousov in the speech points out that NATO countries are planning to increase their defense spending enormously. I'll get onto the likelihood of this in just a moment. And also to improve its ability to, he particularly mentions stationing troops, deploying troops rapidly in the Baltic states. Now, this is something which, of course, we've talked about before, both on this channel and on the Decline and Fall show, the role of the Baltic states. Because if it is the case that the Ukraine war comes to a close in a very unfavorable way for the West, and this is looking likely to be the case, then, and if it is the case that the Kiev regime is ultimately destroyed, which I've long said I think it will have to be, then it leaves the West with a bit of a problem. Well, where are you going to stage your next provocation? If they lose the Kiev regime, that's a whole vast area of territory which they could potentially draw from, or draw personnel from, to launch their next provocation against the Russians in a few years' time. Because according to Belousov's speech and according to everything the European leaders and the British are saying, they are clearly planning to go for some kind of provocation in 2030. Quite what that will be, I think, is more open to interpretation. But the Russian Ministry of Defense is clearly planning for a NATO intervention against Russia by, as Belousov puts it in the report, the early 2030s. So that's a very interesting reflection. I mean, Putin's talked about some of this before, but in more reserved terms. Belousov is absolutely blunt about it, which is that the planning priorities for the Russian Ministry of Defense are centered around the idea that NATO will carry out a direct attack on the Russian Federation of some kind in just over half a decade, or just under half a decade. So 4 to 5 years' time. We're nearly in 2026 now. And that the planning that the Russian Federation is doing in the field of defense is all built around that assumption. And that the NATO countries are planning to move troops rapidly into the east of Europe, and the Baltic states are mentioned in particular, in order that some kind of intervention can be done. Now, this has been talked about before by various unhinged NATO military officials about the idea that they were going to storm Kaliningrad. This is something which has, again, been talked about over and over again, that they could use a NATO force based in the Baltic states to take over this sort of Russian exclave. But of course, that would lead to a direct war with Russia, which would be, I'm not saying it would inevitably go nuclear, maybe it wouldn't, but it would be a potentially very disastrous war, because it would lead to a direct Russian invasion of the Baltic states, which is really the only purpose of the Baltic states being in NATO. Let's be honest. They're not adding anything militarily, nor will they ever. The bankrupt comprador fascistic swine that run the Baltic states, what is their role? Their role really in being in NATO is to provide a platform for either an attack on Russia or the staging of a provocation to bring on a Russian invasion of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And the only provocation that's big enough to do that would be some kind of aggression against Kaliningrad. Now, that would be a dramatic raising of the stakes. I still don't think that by 2030 to 31 that the NATO forces will be capable of doing that. I don't. But they are talking about it, and it's clear that the Russians are taking the idea of that seriously as they being the next point of provocation. So we can read some interesting things into Belousov's comments there, because according to Andrei Belousov, and again, this speech is not readily available in its full version to an English-speaking audience. There is a full text of Belousov's speech, at least the part of the speech that the Russian government deems to be acceptable for public release, but it's on the English language page of the Russian Ministry of Defense website, which you need to use a VPN to get onto, and it'll only load on certain browsers. So that's where I got it from. I'd encourage you, if you have the time, to go and read the whole thing, because what's clear is that the thinking in the hierarchy of the Russian Ministry of Defense is that Ukraine as a state and as an entity will be destroyed to the point where it can't pose any threat, or NATO can't use it, I should say, to pose any threat to the Russian Federation by 2030, because they'll have comprehensively destroyed its ability to do so. Now, that will either take the form of the complete destruction of the armed forces of Ukraine to the point where Ukraine can't even field any armies anymore because they've simply lost too many people, or the Kiev regime is ultimately destroyed and Russia controls most of the territory of what's now Ukraine, or the great bulk of it, possibly apart from the West. And that there will be no potential for NATO trying any funny business with the Russians on the territory of Ukraine, because they won't have a political entity like they do now with the Kiev regime to hide behind in doing so. And so the planning assumption of the Russians, therefore, turns to the Baltic states. Now, this is, I'll come back to that in just a moment, but The other key points that Belousov highlighted was the continued modernization of the Russian armed forces via the integration of like a new whole new units and whole organizations inside the Russian armed forces dedicated to the study of and the practice of drone warfare, the inclusion of things like sea drones in the Russian naval doctrine, the continued revolutionizing of the Russian air defense systems, of Russian long and medium and short range missiles, the continual upgrading of the Russian submarine fleet to include new submarines which can launch intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can launch the Russian equivalent of like cruise missiles. So, for instance, the Oreshnik, and also, of course, the deployment of mobile launchers which can launch Oreshniks at enemies on the battlefield. Belousov also talks about the fact that they're having more success now delivering things like ammunition supplies to frontline positions, not using like armored vehicles or heavy military trucks, because those are too bigger targets for drone power, but using like robots, using fast-moving like pickup trucks and cars to be able to get away from the drone coverage, because the drone coverage in Ukraine on both sides is very comprehensive. So it's very difficult to move anything to the front line now unless you've got counter drone operations, which is why Belousov highlights the need to build up specialized units. Now, taken together with what they're planning to do in terms of their priorities over the next year, they're planning to get the S-500 air defense system comprehensively deployed across the Russian Federation. They're planning to make the Oreshnik more mobile. They're planning to further upgrade their nuclear submarine fleet so it can launch various missiles of various different natures at targets, presumably in NATO states. They're planning on revolutionizing or carry on the revolution in drone warfare. They're also planning on upgrading their officer corps. So Belousov was relatively open about some problems that had existed in the Russian Ministry of Defense, because, of course, previously the Russian Ministry of Defense in sort of the 90s and the 2000s had a reputation as being very incompetent and very corrupt, which is a sort of product of the total collapse of the Soviet military instigated by Gorbachev, and the Russian military carried through by Yeltsin. Now, so what they're talking about, they've been slowly undoing under Shoigu, and now more rapidly under Belousov, is undoing the corruption and incompetence that defined the Russian MOD for a very long time. So they're doing things like things which are quite interesting, which are like cataloging the Russian Ministry of Defense's housing facilities. So like making sure that like soldiers get good housing and their families get good housing, revolutionizing battlefield healthcare, which they've had great success in. Belousov makes a reference to what's called the golden hour after a soldier is wounded, in which if you treat them well, treat their wound well in that hour, then they stand a much higher chance of survival. And so he's talking about the innovations that they've made there, but also he's talking about building a much bigger officer corps inside the Russian armed forces. So making the academic training that Russian officers go through of an even higher standard, and making becoming an officer more appealing to those who might otherwise go into civilian work. So what they're talking about is overhauling continuing their overhaul of the Russian armed forces, with the design being they intend to be able to repel, or shall we say deter, a NATO provocation, possibly invasion or some kind of aggression against the Russian Federation by the early 2030s. And so what this is fundamentally is a defensive doctrine. If you read Belousov's speech and you combine it with the most recent release of the Russian national security strategy, which is the one I talked about on a show over 2 weeks ago, where you compare like the Russian national security strategy, which is all about internal policy towards the many different nationalities and cultural, religious, and linguistic groups inside Russia, in order to maintain a unified nation. You look at the Russian defense strategy, which is all about literal defense of Russia against NATO aggression. And then you compare that to the United States, where the United States is talking constantly, you got to do this in Trump's voice. We will have the greatest navy anywhere in the world, Trump ships, the Golden Fleet. It's going to be made of gold, just like my tower. It's going to have the most amazing big missiles, the best missiles, unbelievable missiles, missiles that will blow your head clean off if you just pictured them in your mind. Look at this lovely AI rendering. I'm surprised, by the way, that he didn't have like women from the Miss Universe contest unveiling the AI slop art of the Trump battleship. But in all seriousness, like the US national security strategy that Trump released and sort of signed off on, I should say, talks about continued global dominance for the US in all military spheres, and the need to be able to project power anywhere in the world. The Russian defense policy and Russian national security strategies talk about ensuring that the internal, shall we say, the home front in Russia is secured, making sure that the contradictions that do exist between the different cultural, linguistic, national, and religious groups in Russia are managed to the point where contradictions between them can't be exploited by external powers, which of course is what the British and Americans did with regard to Chechnya. It's what they've done with regard to, of course, Ukraine. It's what they will do with regards to what they've done with regard to the South Caucasus in general. But their Ministry of Defence's strategy is about improving and defending the borders of the Russian Federation against potential NATO aggression. So it's a night and day comparison just in terms of policy documents. In every US document, it's about global leadership. National security means being able to hit anyone, anywhere in the world, at any time. We'll blow your fucking head off. Coming to the Nigeria story later, by the way. And then the Russian strategy, which is a defensive strategy based on the defense of the Russian Federation, not about projecting military power everywhere else in the world. Now, they do talk in the Ministry of Defense document and Belousov's speech about selling more Russian arms to partners, promoting Russian armaments to nations which work closely with the Russian Federation. So the Russians do, of course, engage in arms dealing. But again, like, that doesn't make you an imperialist power. It's clear that the defense strategy, the national security strategy, make it absolutely clear that if you compare Russia to the United States, it is absolutely crystal clear who the imperialist power is. The imperialist power is the United States. And it's very open about its intentions in the national security document and elsewhere. And the comparison with the Russians is that Russia is, of course, a capitalist country, but it's a non-imperialist country, and it's a country which is basing its doctrines on defending its current borders, not extending those borders to cover the entire world in terms of the presumed right of the US to blow up anybody that it wants to. In the words of Anthony Hopkins' version of Richard Nixon, the president can bomb anybody he likes, So this is, again, a very interesting document, identifies clearly that the Russians expect some kind of NATO provocation or NATO attack involving the Baltic states by 2030 or 2031. So let's keep an eye on that. Now, we'll come back to the question of whether NATO is going to be capable of doing that in just a moment, because this leads us rather neatly into the story about the conscription affair in Britain. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the history of conscription in perfidious Albion, you will know that the conscription was done away with in Britain by the early 1960s. In fact, my late uncle, was one of the last call-ups to serve in the British Army. He served over in Malaysia, as it is now. But that was done away with by the early 1960s because maintaining an army of the size that Britain had in the 50s was costing too much. And of course, there was the constant fear that if you trained too many working class men in arms, that might come back to bite you later on. So the British did away with conscription over 60 years ago. They've been shrinking the size of their armed forces ever since then. British Army, in terms of the actual army, the size of army that it has now, has infamously could fit inside a football stadium. The actual number of fighting men that they could field is less than 20,000. So that's not something which is means that you can have great confidence that when the British go marching off to war against the Russians, it'll then be anything other than, as the Americans say, a turkey shoot. So what is Starmer's game with this talk of conscription? Because again, he hasn't brought back conscription. That would be too much. What he's done is announce that there's going to be a gap year offering to people aged 18 years and over who are at university age. And it's going to be, a scheme is going to be known as the Armed Forces Foundation Scheme. And it's going to launch in March of next year. The plan is to bring in an initial batch of 150 people into temporary military service. So 150 people in March 2026. So that's not a great deal. So we'll see if they even get to those numbers. But what is this plan? Because this isn't standing on its own. We had the chief of the defense staff recently saying war with Russia is coming. We heard Blaise Metravelli, granddaughter of a Ukrainian fascist, head of MI6, saying the same thing. So what's actually going on? Well, as with anything else, there's never just one reason for anything. On the one level, this is all posturing. This is a lot of posturing going on here, and it's related specifically to the status of the negotiations that are going on with, amongst the Americans and Europeans and Ukrainians to try and present some kind of peace deal to the Russians. A big part of what the British have been doing is trying to make it look as if they would be capable of making some move on the Russians at some point, trying to inspire confidence in the Zelensky regime that, maybe in a few years' time, you hang on, the British will come sailing into the Black Sea as if this was 1855 and discharge some regiments of Royal Marines on the sands near Odessa and march off to fight the Rus to front up with the Ruskies. And so this confidence trick that the British government is engaged in is part of what's going on here. A lot of war talk, a lot of talk of spending more money, whilst in reality, as we've chronicled before on this channel and on the Decline and Fall show, the British can't do shit. They can't even build a functioning tank at the moment. Their aging Challenger 2 tanks can barely be fielded because they've only got between like 20 and 30 of them that actually function. Like their armored fighting vehicle, that Ajax vehicle that they tried to build recently, they did build it, they tried to use it. It gave every single soldier that used it extreme hearing damage to the point where several of them couldn't walk properly. They have outsourced their production of their arms to the United States. Their submarine fleet barely functions anymore, despite calling for a renewal of it. Again, like the British defense contracts absorb a lot of money and produce very little. The whole industry is tremendously inefficient and ineffective. British generals admit that they would run out of ammunition against the Russians if they had to fight a full-blown war, but in a few days. The Russian Air Force would destroy its British equivalent in a couple of weeks if they tried to launch an attack inside Ukraine. So what is any of this likely to change by 2031. Now, could it change theoretically? Could Starmer or whoever succeeds him go for it with conscription? Say, right, that's it. You know, every 21-year-old to 40-year-old has to do a year or 18 months or 2 years. My guess it would be a year service in one branch of the armed forces from now on. That would be an unprecedented step to take. It would also be a very destabilizing step to take. It would explode a lot of contradictions, but it's not impossible that Starmer just turns around and says it. But as always with British government announcements, you have to look beyond the headlines and into what the actual reality is, which is, can the British realistically field some form of army that could actually do some damage to the Russians and not just get wiped out in 5 years' time? Could they do it as part of a NATO force, for instance? So NATO, again, if they're without the United States, there is no NATO. So first things first, by 2030, is it going to be the case that the US will be itself ready to take on the Russians? Because at the moment, the US can't take on the Russians either, or even vaguely hope to. And they know that, which is why that they are desperately trying to reach some kind of settlement in Ukraine, but none of them can agree on what that settlement looks like because they don't want to lose the services of the Kiev regime. Now, will Trump and drunk old Pete Hegseth of the Pentagon be able to revolutionize the US armed forces by 2030 to do what the Russians expect them to do, which is to stage some sort of provocation? Again, it's not impossible. The US government could use the powers that they do have under the Defense Production Act to basically seize control of the military-industrial complex of the United States, to look to guarantee supply chains of rare earth metals, to find those that are outside of Chinese control for usage, to make sure you can supply the military-industrial complex of the United States. They could, of course, institute conscription in the United States itself to boost armed forces numbers, or they could radically alter the package deal that US forces get, because at the moment you've got many US personnel like literally on the breadline sometimes because they're paid so little. So they could either institute conscription, which would be, again, a big throw of the dice for the rulers of the United States. They got rid of it in the 70s after the experience in the Vietnam War. You don't want huge numbers of unwilling people pulled out of civilian life, tossed into a war that's unwinnable, to die in huge numbers, because it tends to make things rather unstable back home. And they have avoided doing it for many, many years and don't want to do it now. So could they then do something else? Could they dramatically improve the package, the financial package that's offered for armed forces personnel? So, I mean, this is something that the Russians have done and continue to do. Make military service much more rewarding financially, basically extend the sort of welfare state type provisions that the military has inside the United States to provide for soldiers' families, to lure in more recruits that way. Because, you know, God knows you ain't getting any healthcare in the United States from the government unless you do join the military. So could the sort of welfare type provisions be extended as part of the package for military families? Now, that could be done. I don't think it will, because the system's too rotten to do that. Could they rapidly upgrade their industrial production? Again, technically possible, but you'd need an officialdom that actually understood the problem. And none of the current officialdom in the United States really understands the problem. Some of them have got an inkling that they need to do something to revitalize their industrial base, but none of them really understand the reasons why they don't have an industrial base anymore, or at least they don't have anything like the one that they did even as relatively recently as the early 1990s. I mean, we went into like the sheer gap that exists between the potential for the Chinese shipbuilding and, of course, Russian shipbuilding as well, with regard to the competition with the United States. The United States just can't compete with Russia or China with regard to shipbuilding, and 5 years isn't going to change that. I mean, you would literally need a level of effort akin to like the first 5-year plan in the Soviet Union to turn around the defense production bases and the wider industrial production bases of like Germany, France, Britain, and the United States, which are the principal countries in NATO that would need to do a lot of the fighting. So, because the that slippery bastard Erdogan isn't going to want the Turks involved in a war against the Russians. He'll want to play both sides, as he always does, or his successor will want to do roughly the same thing. So without the Turkish army, because that's the second biggest one in NATO, which wouldn't, I don't think under any Turkish government would want to be directly involved in a war against the Russians. Too much exposure for them. But without that, without the Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Italy having their defense production base revolutionized in the next 5 years, without a rapid expansion of the number of decently trained, well-armed, well-provisioned men that can hope to stand a chance of going up against the Russians, will NATO actually be in a position to do anything by 2030? No. My guess would be no. This is a lot of talk. Now, of course, the Russians, it's not a surprise, are obliged to take this seriously because they keep saying it. They keep staging provocations. Various different German and French and British officials keep talking up war. So if you're Russian, you're obliged to take that seriously. My guess is, though, that neither in Germany or Britain will they overcome the huge problems facing them with regard to defense production. Friedrich Merz's great idea of giving Rheinmetall an infinite budget to do a lot of this won't do anything other than boost the profits of Rheinmetall. We'll get to 2030, and while the armed forces of the European countries might be somewhat larger, a little bit better equipped, they'll have some success in some areas. So, for instance, the British intend to overhaul their navy by 2030. They're reasonably confident they can do that. I don't share that confidence. The British Navy basically at the moment is falling to pieces. But they won't be in a position where they can actually take on the Russians. So what do they actually hope to do by 2030? Certainly, Keir Starmer's gap year for 18-year-olds isn't going to do much of anything to improve the chances of taking on the Russians. So what is this actually all about? There's two aspects of this, one foreign and one domestic. We'll deal with the domestic aspect first. A lot of this, as I've said before, whether it's from Macron or it's from Merz or it's from Starmer in particular, or Maloney, is not about the Russians per se. It's about the internal politics of this. It's about the internal security questions for the ruling classes of Europe. Is so for the United States as well, but the US ruling class is much more divided about which tactic to use, or which country to go after. For the Europeans and the British, there's no doubt. They have been looking for a unifying narrative to use to try and rally at least a significant section of their population behind the current government, or the current establishment, I should say. For many, many years. They tried to use Al-Qaeda. Well, that's never going to work. They're now trying the Russians. And the expanded armed forces that will exist in 2030 will not be in a place which can enable them to take on the Russians. However, they may well be more effective at domestic repression, which is what most of this is about. It's not exclusively about that. There is a foreign side to it, which I'll get to in just a moment. But a lot of this is about narrative management internally. It's about rallying people behind the flag. It's creating and trying to create a state of near war whilst not actually having a real one. That's what I think that is absolutely what Merz, actually, we'll leave Merz to one side. He might have different motivations. It's certainly what Macron's motivations are. It's certainly what the British political establishment motivations are. They are absolutely determined to use this for internal purposes of internal repression, to be able to create a condition of a simulated war inside the country. Remember that old phrase that's attributed to, I believe it was an American or British official. So it said, if you can't win the real war, win the imaginary one. So the purposes of the British is to create will try and create in the minds of the population an imaginary war against an enemy, which of course the British chief of the defense staff, the head of MI6, the senior defense and intelligence people in Britain, they all know very well the Russians aren't going to be sailing up the Thames anytime soon. That would be rather funny if they did. They know that that's not the case. They know the Russians have no intention of doing that. But they'd like to create the impression in the minds of the population that there's a chance of it happening, which is why they speak in like these both dramatic terms and vague terms at the same time. I'm going to be doing a full examination of the comments of the MI6 chief and the chief of the defense staff in a show later in the week. But this is about creating an impression of war, the impression of a crisis, the impression of there is a need to rally behind the government, there is a need to carry out further repressions, there is a need for the labeling of anybody who questions the government as, particularly with regard to foreign defense policy, as a traitor to be thrown in prison, as a pro-Russian traitor, etc. This is what a lot of this is about. From the certainly with regard to Britain, I'd argue the same is true of France as well. Germany, that is part of the motivation. I would argue that the German imperialists are also getting a bit desperate because the project for which a lot of their profits depended upon, that is the EU, is looking more and more unstable, and potentially there are rebellious elements to it. German imperialists might have a different motivation. They might also be motivated by the idea of pushing further with some kind of European or pan-European defense policy that's been blocked in the past, partially at the instigation of the United States. The Germans, Merz in particular, might fancy the idea of a German-dominated EU rapid reaction force or something, but that would principally be used to defend the interests of German imperialism in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, I think. Again, the chances of them taking on the Russians directly are relatively small, and certainly if they were foolish enough to expect to win, that would not be a bet that would come off. So there are other motivations besides going to war with the Russians, which are more important. However, we return to the prospect of, well, what will the provocation be? Because bear in mind, what the US tactic is at the moment is to try and calm things down with regards to the Russian side of things so they can focus on the Chinese side of things. Now, what's the US tactic in the Chinese, the confrontation with the Chinese? The tactic is to essentially do in Taiwan, or do with Taiwan, what's been done with Ukraine. Try and provoke some kind of crisis in Taiwan that can then be used to try and create a state of war with the Chinese, and use that as an opportunity to try and sanction China to death or blockade it. That's their plan. And the people they're going to use to fight that are Taiwanese, Japanese, and Filipino, maybe Australians as well, but let the Southeast Asians go first. And that's the idea. And that's clearly where the US is, what the US is leaning towards right now. That's why they want to calm things down for a few years with the Russians so they can focus on the Pacific side of things. Now, for the British and the French and the Germans, a provocation with regard to Kaliningrad would be something that some of them are stupid enough to think that they either could pull it off or that they would get somebody else to pull it off. Now, here we get to some of the meaning behind the defense partnerships. We're not just with Ukraine, but the British defense partnership with Poland. Because in my view, if they are set on staging a provocation over Kaliningrad, and it would seem that some of them are, then it would be the case that they would need some kind of local force to do a lot of the fighting for them. Given the dangers, if you're going to stage a provocation against the Russians over Kaliningrad, you need a force that can be on the ground rapidly to respond to it. And even if you have troops posted in the Baltics, you wouldn't be able to. They wouldn't be able to post enough to respond to a situation over Kaliningrad. The only nation that can conceivably do that, and which apparently has gained a lot of experience in the special military operation, would be the Poles. And this is, I think, what lies behind the British allegiance with Poland, which is they have this idea that, well, if we need to stage another incident and engage the Russians in another war, Kaliningrad is the ideal place to do it, and Poland's the ideal nation to carry it off. And it will be something that would take place outside of NATO structures, which again be something that the US has talked about before. When there was talk of deploying European forces to Ukraine the first time round under the Biden administration, the Americans made it clear that they weren't going to join in. But if the Europeans wanted to do it, then they'd be right behind them. And strangely, the idea didn't go anywhere. The idea being that it would be, in the case of Kaliningrad, the Poles that would do a lot of the fighting. Now, again, that would depend upon whether the Polish population doesn't object too loudly to this. Now, I know that they've been soaked in anti-Russian propaganda for decades, but would they be very keen on a shooting war? My guess would be no. But that is the reason why the British have signed these agreements with the Poles, and that would be the typical British way of doing things, which is find a sucker and get them to absorb the punches for you. So a NATO war by 2030. I mean, I am assuming, of course, then it is the correct assumption to make that the Russians have access to far more intelligence than I do. But you can tell what the intentions are of the NATO countries by the way that they act. The NATO countries aren't acting quick enough to be able to field vast armies against the Russians by 2030. What they might be able to do, though, is to, again, stage provocations and get the Russians then bogged down in another nasty war by 2030. That might be something that they'd be capable of doing. And to do that, and to have their proxies act with a degree of confidence that the British cavalry will be charging over the hill to save them, well, then you need to at least look as if you're building up your forces. But what you're actually doing is building up your production base to supply your bullet sponges by 2030. Because that's what the British are looking for. They're not looking to fight the Russians themselves. If Ukraine goes down in flames, they'll be looking for a successor to Ukraine by 2030. Poles, maybe, but that could cause domestic problems in Poland. Baltic states would be the ideal place to do this. Again, unlike Ukraine, it's literally the opposite problem. Ukraine has vast spaces with a vast steppe with very few people in it. The Baltics have very few people in them, but also have very little space. Any Russian invasion there would be quick and is very destructive, and would take out whatever was there quite quickly. So it poses certain problems. But again, it's other than Moldova, it's the best option for NATO staging provocations. Moldova would also be an option for staging a provocation, particularly if the Russians end up going all the way to Odessa. But then you have the additional complication of Transnistria. But so it wouldn't surprise me if they tried something in Moldova, but Moldova is still somewhat contested territory. The regime they have in place there is dependent upon the votes of Moldovans who live and work in Europe for its survival. Whether any of those are going to want to go back if there's a shooting war with the Russians, that's a rather doubtful thing. But yeah, the NATO provocation that will come, and undoubtedly something will come. It won't probably be a direct intervention against the Russians by the armed forces of Britain, France, Germany, or the United States. It'll be lining up another sucker to do it for them, and to support said sucker in its inevitable destruction. And that would be the plan the British will have. So they will expand their armies, but only in order to look more credible and for the purposes of internal repression. The fighting and the dying, they plan on having somebody else doing most of that. So moving on then to look at another question, which is the Trump administration's recent rather strange activities over the sky, in the skies above Nigeria. Now, recently, the Trump administration bombed an area in Nigeria called Sokoto. Now, Sokoto is like an area of the country as well as a city in Nigeria. So, why did the Trump administration drop a bunch of bombs on Sokoto? Now, Sokoto, if you're not familiar with it, is in the far northwest of Nigeria. I'd never heard of it until the Americans dropped some bombs around it. It sits just south of the border with Niger, and it sits just not well certain distance away from Burkina Faso, and also it's relatively close, of course, with Niger between it and Mali, but it's relatively close to Mali. So why is the US getting involved and dropping bombs up here? The claim was that they were dropping bombs and we're bombing ISIS. We're saving our precious Christians, wonderful people, great people, just don't want them in our country. Why are they bombing Sokoto? Now, the Financial Times claims to be mystified by this. So now the northwestern part of Nigeria they bombed is, of course, a heavy Muslim area, but neither ISIS nor Boko Haram are particularly active around Sokoto. So why drop the bombs there at all? Now, part of this is, of course, we should always make the assumption that whatever reason Trump gave or the Trump administration gave is probably a lie. Now, Trump talked about intervention in Nigeria a while back, and here we need to look at like what method of warfare is the US going to use here, because Nigeria not only is a place, of course, of enormous oil and gas reserves, huge amount of human capital, labor potential, should we say, and the US, of course, is going to want to control the oil and gas reserves that are present in Nigeria. They already have a hack stool pigeon in the form of Bola Tinubu, former drug dealer in his Chicago days, in place as president there. So what would be the plan here for the Trump administration? Well, there's two things, I think. Firstly, a phony crusade against a fake enemy in Nigeria would, of course, make Trump look like he's doing something and would make him look like a real winner in the eyes of the US press. Whereas at the moment, he's looking kind of like a loser over this confrontation that he's engaged in over Venezuela. The Venezuelan campaign is not going well. The Trump, again, according to Susie Wiles, his own chief of staff, expected the Maduro to capitulate after they'd blown up some speedboats. And given how stupid Trump is, I fully expect him to actually have believed that. The fact that the Venezuelans have not capitulated, and then have also not capitulated when the US started hijacking oil tankers. Though interestingly, they seem to have left one that was of interest to the Chinese that seems to have slipped through the blockade. The whole campaign is one of intimidation with the expectation that your opponent will just roll over and die. And given that the PSUV and the Venezuelan nation not only refused to die, not only refused to surrender, but taking their revolutionary process forward by creating vast civilian militias to defend the country against the US invasion, this is something which is the US clearly didn't bargain for. So they've been left with their dicks out, looking rather foolish, basically, in the Caribbean. So this then makes us return to the question of, well, why bomb Sokoto? Why have this fake campaign to save our precious Christians in Nigeria, which, of course, Donald Trump and the US administration and wider US ruling class couldn't give less of a shit about Nigerians of whatever faith they are. So why do it? Now, this goes back to like war on terror type planning here. If you want to take over the running of a country, now you've had to do it in a neo-colonial fashion since the 50s. You can't really make direct colonialism stick anymore. So what do you need to do? You need to make sure that you have a comprehensive set of military assets, either in or around that country, and they have a solid justification for being there. If the US wants to gain control over Nigeria, more control than Bola Tinubu offers them, for instance, then you not only would need a credible sounding reason to be there, but also you would need to find a justification for having large amounts of military assets available to you inside that country for a long period of time. The presence of Boko Haram or ISIS or both would be that reason. And what you would then seek to do by having, so we say, a series of security agreements with the Nigerians is establish a greater and greater US stranglehold over the government and security of Nigeria. Nigeria also has very significant military forces. So if you could gain control over that, you gain control over the Nigerian government, again, more so than you do now. You gain control over the Nigerian military. You, of course, have greater say over what happens to all that oil and gas. But if you are successful at this, if you can successfully claim that you are needing to respond to the dire threats of the Boko Haram, they keep burning books, it's terrible. I've never read a book, but I would love the opportunity to do so. If you can successfully present this as like war on terror type fighting ISIS stuff, you could try and pull off the same thing that the French were doing in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, which is take control of a country whilst claiming you need to be there to fight the evil terrorists, while strangely enough, never actually doing anything to rid the country of the evil terrorists. This would be the move in Nigeria, because if you successfully establish control over Nigerian military assets and successfully gained a boot print in Nigeria, then you could do what would be the real work. And the real work and the real reason to be concerned, if you're the United States with Northwest Nigeria, is the AES, the Alliance of the Sahel States. Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and to a certain extent, Chad as well. So if you manage to get into and control Nigeria, you are then, as the US, are in a position where you can then run operations against the Burkinabes, against the Nigerians, against the Malians. And getting rid of the free radical nationalist governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, that's the real agenda, along with getting hold of the oil and gas, etc. So to a certain extent, this is about Trump, posturing and trying to get over the humiliation he's suffered so far in Venezuela. But the bigger objective is to control West Africa in order to crush the revolutionary processes which are underway in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. That's the game. That's what the Americans are actually up to. They watched as the French were booted out, saw it as an opportunity to move in themselves. That's what they're doing. And before we know it, the US will be announcing that it has to bomb Niger, it has to bomb Mali, it has to bomb Burkina Faso, because there's all of these terrorists out there, which of course will be used to target anything other than the terrorists, target anything other than Al-Qaeda in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, but to target, for instance, their military installations, to blackmail the governments of those three countries with the threat of US bombing campaigns, special forces operations, all kinds of disruptive activities being unleashed on these countries, all in the name of fighting terror, whilst really the aim is to undermine and destroy the revolutionary governments that exist in those three countries. That's the ultimate game. Does Trump know that? Maybe. I don't think he'd care if they told him, but it's certainly what the US planners are thinking of. They see this as a much easier win for them than trying to fight it out in Venezuela, which they know they can't do, and they certainly know they can't win. Nigeria presents a much more promising target for them. Now, I would say, just in closing on this question, And of course, there's no guarantee that they're going to get this their own way. Nigeria has a very large and potentially very powerful working class. The Nigerian working class is, of course, has engaged in a lot of battles over the years. There's no reason to believe that should the US try this very reckless maneuver and, trying to turn Nigeria into a pure puppet state, a pure neo-colony, that the Nigerian working class would not revolt. And also the truth about who's really backing Boko Haram might come out as well. And there's a lot of people who'd be very interested to know who's really behind the men in the black masks. You'll be surprised to know that it's the same people who are behind them everywhere else. See past issues of decline and fall for more on that one. But before we draw things to a close for today, I will just take a look at the latest stuff in the chat. Petr Nikolov says the Poles always in between the Germans and the Russians. They always seem to make wrong decisions. Interesting. Mr. Xavier Rises says, question, will Ukraine look similar to Chechnya after this war, rebuilt and part of the Russian Republic? I think part of it will. So I've said before, like I expect that they will, in the end, they will have to take Kiev to destroy the Kiev regime once and for all. They'll have to take most of the coast. If they can't get any kind of meaningful deal out of the Americans, which they won't, then they'll have to take the coast. They'll have to take Kiev. They'll have to control the Dnieper River and take quite a good chunk of the interior of the country, leaving the far west to be squabbled over by the Poles, Hungarians, Slovaks, etc. And I expect then that Kiev will be restored as essentially a major city, a major Russian city again. That's what I imagine will happen. And again, in the end, that will be something that will be dictated by the fact that the imperialists won't give the Russians a deal which will be acceptable to them. Yes, it will probably be anywhere they take over, they'll just incorporate inside the Republic of the Russian Federation. There may be, of course, different forms of governance for that. So, like the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk is something that sort of emerged organically. But I imagine Russian control over Kiev will be something which doesn't actually generate a huge amount of opposition from the people who remain in Kiev. The serious hardcore Nazis will go west and camp out in Bandera land in western Ukraine, which I don't think the Russians will want to take anyway. Michael Hundayan will be a good guest to have on to talk about Nigeria. Yes, I will definitely have him put him on the list. Sid says US government robbing people at gunpoint on the open seas could send the wrong message to many men in the US. Indeed. Petr Nikolov says Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, Iran, Venezuela, China, Nigeria, US on the warpath. Yes, and in most of those they will fail. Alex Oliveira says Viva Chavez, Maduro y la revolución bolivariana. Indeed. Sophia says, was Trump putting on a show for his evangelical base than trying to reduce violence in Nigeria? His holy rollers claim there is Christian genocide going on there. None of these people give a shit about Christian genocide. Let's be clear about that. Most of those people couldn't point to Nigeria on a fucking map. This is just the justification for the things I was talking about earlier. This is like the transparent justification. The transparent real reason for it is, of course, resource grab and the attack on the Sahel states. The throwing the idea of saving the Christians out there, that's just something for the suckers at home to hoover up. Right. Iman says Islamic extremists can either provide a pretext for direct military action or proxy troops for regime change. Very true. David King says here the French tried to coup tried a coup operation from Nigeria recently. Yes, indeed. French spies keep getting arrested in Niger, etc. Kiwi Corner 888 says, the incredible shrinking country of Ukraine, led by little man Zelensky, that NATO continues to support at any cost of the alliance taxpayers. French now using Nigeria as a base for coup operations, says David King. Very true. Right. Do get Natalie Yam to talk about AES Sahel. I will certainly check her out. Right. Okay. So we are on the 8:30 mark. So I'm going to draw things to a close for today. I'll be back again with you tomorrow with another episode of the Decline and Fall show. Which will be, of course, brought to you by myself and my comrade and co-host, Kit Clarenberg. So please be sure to join me again for that one. This show will return again on Tuesday of the upcoming week. We'll be getting together a review of the year show for you quite soon. So thanks to everybody who's joined the stream today. There will be another upcoming stream on Patreon pretty soon about the Ethiopian revolution, so be sure to join me for that as well. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. Until then, here's some music.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.